Welcome to the Explainer. If you've ever wondered why gas prices seem to just instantly spike the second there's a foreign conflict, or why the shift to green energy feels like this massive geopolitical tug-of-war, well, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into a fascinating study by Elyas, and it really pulls back the curtain on the hidden architecture of global power. We're going to look at exactly how the political economy of fossil fuels has shaped our modern world, and, more importantly, how that very same system is, right now, colliding with the urgent realities of ecological collapse. Okay, let's dive into this. Who really controls the global climate transition? Seriously, think about it. We often think of the shift to green energy as this neutral, technology-driven march toward progress. But this study reveals what it calls a massive illusion of control. It challenges us to look beyond just the solar panels and the wind turbines and to actually see the geopolitical chessboard sitting right underneath it all. This transition, it isn't just about saving the planet. It's a super high-stakes battle over who gets to dictate the future of global power. And that brings us to the geographical heart of this research. The study actually frames this perfectly. It says, the Middle East emerges not just as a theater of conflict, but as the crucible in which the future of the global political economy is being forged. It's a really powerful quote. The research is basically arguing that we have to stop viewing the Middle East as just some passive background where proxy wars happen, or, just a giant gas station for the global economy. Instead, it is the absolute center of our future global stability. What happens there, with its hydrocarbon reserves and its intense climate vulnerabilities, is literally going to dictate the fate of the entire world. Section 1. Environmental Hegemony Explained, the Hidden Architecture of Power. So the crucial point is, to truly grasp the scope of this global crisis, we first need to define the core framework at play here, which is environmental hegemony. The study defines it as a framework where whoever controls the energy doesn't just manage oil markets, they actually define the very rules of international relations and global development. Think of it kind of like the operating system of the global economy. Whoever codes that system gets to set the rules for everyone else. Dominant global powers use this framework to maintain control by essentially masking the inherent volatility of extracting and using fossil fuels. It dictates that to be a modern developed nation, you absolutely must participate in this carbon-intensive system. And that just reinforces a hierarchy where the powers that control the energy flows, well, they rule the world. Moving on to Section 2, the Century of Oil, Constructing Hydrocarbon Modernity. So, how exactly did this invisible system of power actually get built? The research maps out 4 distinct eras that entrench Middle Eastern oil as the structural fulcrum of Western hegemony. It all starts back in 1927 with the discovery of oil in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. This birthed an era of concessionary capitalism, where foreign corporations essentially bought the rights to outsource the economic destiny of the entire region. Then a massive shift occurs in 1960 with the formation of OPEC. This marked a major moment of resource nationalism. Producer states were finally seeking to reclaim their agency. And that builds directly into the 1973 Arab oil embargo, which was this profound geopolitical shockwave. It proved that the global south could absolutely weaponize energy to disrupt northern prosperity. Finally, we hit the 1990 Gulf War. This represents the definitive fusion of resource protectionism and military hegemony, proving that external superpowers would, without hesitation, intervene militarily just to preserve the status quo of oil flows. Section 3. Engineered Market Instability. Volatility as a feature, not a bug. This brings us to one of the most provocative arguments in the entire research paper. We often look at the chaos in global energy markets and just assume it's the unfortunate result of natural market fluctuations or maybe unpredictable crises. But the author introduces this concept of strategic scarcity. According to the text, dominant state actors use strategic scarcity as a deliberate tool of statecraft. In other words, it's a geopolitical weapon used to discipline peripheral states. Rather than just a geological constraint, meaning, we simply don't have enough oil at a given moment, scarcity is actually often engineered. When a dominant power perceives a threat, it can incentivize or coerce producing nations to restrict output, inducing these massive price spikes that act as direct economic warfare. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how this artificial scarcity is created. It's really a mix of tactics. First, it's the weaponization of production quotas to gain diplomatic leverage. Then it's the petrodollar system, where oil acts like a highly volatile stock market asset, amplifying minor physical shocks into massive economic crises. It's also the inadequate global governance. You have institutions like the IAA and OPEC acting in fragmented national interests rather than aiming for global stability. And right now, It's premature transition divestment. Capital is fleeing fossil fuels way faster than green alternatives are actually scaling up, and that creates a super fragile supply base capable of just snapping under minimal stress. Section 4, the climate breaking point, unrest and the climate conflict nexus. But here is the thing. This carefully managed old oil order is fracturing, and the study points to climate change as the ultimate force multiplier that's breaking the system apart. The research highlights a really critical domestic crisis occurring right now, which is the decoupling of state legitimacy from resource distribution in petro-states. For decades, the social contract in these rentier economies, states that rely almost entirely on exporting resources like oil, was pretty simple. The state distributes wealth, and in exchange, it gets political compliance. But as environmental degradation mounts and populations grow, these states are seriously struggling to buy that social peace, and it's destroying the very foundation of their domestic stability. Just look at the prolonged droughts that preceded the Syrian uprising to see exactly how this unfolds on the ground. Climate-induced droughts displaced hundreds of thousands of rural citizens right into urban centers. This resource scarcity acted as a massive force multiplier for political violence, stretching the state's capacity absolutely to the breaking point. And this isn't just a local tragedy either. It causes a huge erosion of global market confidence. It really represents a definitive shift away from that era of managed, predictable oil stability, straight into an era of terrifying ecological volatility that threatens global supply chains across the board. Section 5, the green colonialism threat, co-opting the transition. Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is how global powers are responding if the old system is breaking. The author warns that the necessary shift to green energy is currently being manipulated by existing hegemons. Notice the stark contrast here. Under the old fossil fuel order, dominance was maintained through military coercion and the direct extraction of physical resources, right? But the study argues that Western powers are attempting to maintain their dominance in the new era through what it calls green colonialism. So instead of military force, the new tools of hegemony are the control of intellectual property, monopolizing critical mineral supply chains, and setting the green tech standards that the rest of the world has to strictly follow. Meanwhile, the petro-states in the Middle East aren't just sitting idle either. The author critiques a phenomenon they term green nationalism. This is basically the superficial greening by regional powers. Think of slapping a massive, heavily publicized solar farm right next to a rapidly expanding oil field. It's used primarily as a discursive shield. The study argues that the language of sustainability is being co-opted, not out of some altruistic environmental concern, but to legitimize continued extraction, protect their authoritarian structures, and basically ensure their long-term geopolitical relevance in the new green economy. Section 6, a post-carbon Middle East, reclaiming the future. Let's move to and see how this builds into actual solutions. Because to prevent this impending ecological and systemic collapse, the research proposes 3 structural steps to dismantle environmental hegemony. Step 1 is decoupling sovereignty from hydrocarbon revenues by redirecting sovereign wealth exclusively toward climate resilience, things like sustainable agriculture and solar desalination. Step 2 is establishing a global green tech commons to bypass those restrictive intellectual property regimes we just talked about. And step 3 is perhaps the most profound of all, forming an ecological security community. So, what exactly does an ecological security community look like? Well, the study envisions a Middle East water and energy pact. Instead of zero-sum security alliances focused on militarized borders, the region would integrate its solar energy grids, create shared food security strategies, and establish independent technical monitoring bodies. The brilliant insight here is that shared transboundary environmental challenges like water scarcity and massive dust storms could actually be the very mechanism that finally forges regional peace and long-term interdependence. The era of environmental hegemony has truly reached a terminal breaking point. As we wrap up this analysis, the core paradox presented by the author is summarized perfectly in this quote right from the text. The Middle East holds the keys to the world's energy past, yet it risks being locked out of its sustainable future unless profound structural changes occur. The world simply cannot safely transition away from carbon if the region historically built to supply it is allowed to just collapse or remain trapped in extractive dependency. Which leaves us with this final critical thought. The transition to a post-carbon world isn't just an engineering problem, it is a profound political challenge. Based on this research, we have to ask ourselves, what happens to global stability if the old powers simply use the exact same mechanics of hegemony to maintain control over our new green future? It's a very serious question that challenges the foundation of how we view global climate policy. And honestly, it's one we are all going to have to confront in the decades ahead. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.